Well, good evening to a bit of Friday night TV. If you happen to be having a night in tonight, as the whole country remains in level 4, not just tonight, but through till Thursday night, with the country south of the Bombay Hills set to go to level 3, and Auckland and Northland to continue at level 4 for an indeterminate period. There's obviously a lot of people pretty upset about the outcome, but we've got to keep thinking forward and ask, what does all this mean? Well, I'd say it means a couple of things. We've talked about how it means the government just wasn't prepared. They're training up contact tracers because they hadn't done the scenario planning the experts told them to do. They're ramping up vaccination, but it's not clear if they actually have enough vaccine to sustain this rate far into September. They're ramping up wastewater testing, now over 100 sites, having been only 26 sites testing weekly at the start of the outbreak. Altogether, we're seeing a government that has to rely on at least a 2-week lockdown, even from the South Island, because they can't rely on their contact tracing or their testing response to eliminate the possibility of there being cases in the community. All they can do is wait it out for a full 2-week period, so that if there were any cases they didn't know about, they probably would have died out anyway. That has implications for the future. I think the question now has to turn to, how does the government respond? How does it use the time it has now better than the last 18 months so that our future doesn't involve endless and indefinite lockdowns? Those are the kinds of questions ACT will be asking, and we'll be putting forward ideas for how the government could respond better and not find itself in this position month after month, just as it is right now. People can't afford the elimination strategy to rely only on lockdowns. That's why we need better testing, tracing, and the vaccine rollout to sustainably continue at the current pace. But tonight, we're not only talking about vaccination and testing and tracing and COVID and how long lockdowns last and what is our alternative. We're talking about another issue that a lot of people have been approaching ACT lately. A lot of people have been raising on our Honest Conversations tour that we recently did. It's something called 3 waters. People might be asking, well, what on earth is that? Well, for one thing, it is, just by strict definition, the supply of water, wastewater, and stormwater, the 3 types of water infrastructure that any civilization requires to function, not only for households, but also for industry and also for farming. It's created a lot of controversy. The government certainly started with something of a problem. There was the Havelock North poisonings. There's been lead in water in Dunedin. There's been sewage on the beach in Auckland and even on the streets in Wellington. There's councils that are right up against their debt limits, and developers trying to build homes for the next generation who find they simply cannot get a fast enough infrastructure build out to keep developing homes. Those are all real problems. The issue that ACT has is the solution the government's proposed, if anything, will make it worse. What they're saying is that every water system, even if it's a water system that maybe only one farmer uses, just a single bore or a pond or a dam, suddenly becomes subject to national regulation. There's no clear cost-benefit analysis on that, and we're going to be talking about our solution to it. There's also the suggestion that the governance of the country's water infrastructure should be removed from the councils and taken over by 4 Wellington-driven water management operations. And what's more, those water management operations would be 50-50. Like so many things this government does, they put their adherence to the Treaty of Waitangi beyond anything else, it seems. They say that the governance of these 4 entities should be 50% iwi representatives and 50% representatives from the rest of the population. For people who think democracy means one person, one vote, that seems inherently unfair. And even when you take that element away, there's a question of, would these distant entities truly be responsive to the standards that communities want and the ability to pay of each community? To discuss this, we're going to bring in 2 very special people, both of them ACT MPs, one of them, the first, Mark Cameron, and the second, Simon Court. Let's start by welcoming Mark Cameron, the authentic voice of rural New Zealand, a rural dairy farmer, a guy that you can't help but like. Even people that don't want to like him, the most terrible lefties, they think, I want to hate Mark Cameron, but nobody can. We're thrilled to have him in Parliament. And Mark, how's it going in rural? Now, just to check for a townie like me, the cows have all been holding those calves in while there's a lockdown, have they?
Yeah, look, we're pretty much all evening, David. We're pretty much all finished calving now, and yeah, look, we're now looking down the barrel of a mating that's looming large. We start mating in about 6 weeks' time, so calving's almost over. And farming
when you say we start mating, you mean the cows?
Yes, correct. That's correct.
Right. Yeah, just checking. I went and spent some time up on Mark's farm recently, and apart from the fact, as you can see, there's always a lot of challenges in the country with broadband bandwidth. I got to milk a few cows, and it was a really impressive operation Mark's going there. If you have a look at ACT's Facebook pages, you can see something from that. But Mark, there's also been a video on Facebook where you've been showing a pond that you have on your farm. That would be deemed a water system brought under a national regulator under these proposed laws. Is that about the size of it?
Yeah, look, David, that's the sum of it. I mean, a lot of these ponds and irrigation schemes have been made by local communities, and that would be encapsulated in this and what we deem as the Water Services Bill, which is part of the Three Waters reforms. And they're often for the purposes of drinking water, livestock water, and irrigation, and ultimately a provider a long way away from here where we're talking about would have onus over that and obligations to how it's regulated. And that's worrisome for a lot of rural New Zealand communities.
I was about to say, yeah, how are people, you say it's worrisome, how are people reacting in rural New Zealand to the idea that you're going to have this extra level of regulation even on private water systems?
Oh, look, David, they're worried. They see it as another layer of compliance. It's onerous, and really, it's a removal of assets. And if I could just offer one anecdote, here in the Kaipara, 75% of our water is actually self-derived. So we've got tanks on farms. There's only 25% is actually on a town supply scheme. So again, these reforms actually affect how we supply and store our own water. So it's a real worry in provincial New Zealand.
So when it comes to water, there's really two New Zealanders, and a lot of people, city folk like me, might not appreciate this. I actually did grow up with tank water on the outskirts of Whangarei, but there's a lot of people in New Zealand who aren't connected to a water care or a town water supply. They're basically self-serving, collecting their own rainwater or have bores or whatever. And they're also using water not only for drinking and cooking and showering, but actually for irrigation and basically industrial purposes.
Look, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's many rural schemes that are built for the purpose of irrigation and subsequently have farm properties off those schemes. These assets would be removed, their care would be removed from them. In a lot of instances up and down rural New Zealand, these schemes have been self-facilitated. Local communities have facilitated them, and there's not been an issue. And I think in the three water reforms and large length definition in rural New Zealand, there isn't over that.
So just thinking about investment, in order to make.
Sorry, Dave, if you can hear me, I've got.
Yeah, you've cut out a little bit, but just wondering about investment. I mean, you want people to invest in irrigation in order that you can make your farm more productive, and particularly as climate change changes some of the weather patterns and so on, that investment's more and more critical. What might this governance model do to people's certainty about consents and being able to invest in irrigation and water infrastructure on their farms?
I think that would erode a lot of confidence, to be quite honest, moving forward. I know provincial New Zealand has often facilitated these schemes And as you say, they're self-serving schemes, and I think that would erode a lot. And in terms of projected productivity could be affected by it. So in real time, I think this is going to be onerous and heavily compliant, and it's top heavy.
Well, look, thanks, Mark. And just to finish, because we're announcing policy today, so what would ACT do in terms of exempting water systems?
Well, here's a good example, David. We would have a 30 end dwelling carve out. We know a lot of rural small systems schemes have less than 30 dwellings on them. We think that's a fair way at looking at a real problem. We know that there are problems in a lot of metropolitan areas, but this carve out would give certainty to rural communities, and we think that's a wonderful way to proceed.
Okay, well, look, thanks a lot, Mark. I'm now going to bring in Simon Court, so stay right there, Mark, because we're going to get you back for the Q&A. But Simon Court is a civil engineer. He's got to be the most technically competent member of the current Parliament. He's someone who's actually done landfill remediation. He's actually worked on wastewater systems. He's worked in Fiji. He's even worked in dangerous environments like Auckland Council. He is the go-to guy in Parliament when it comes to anything made from concrete, because he's a civil engineer, and he's offering enormous amounts of technical expertise on select committees and in the House and in our caucus. We're very grateful to have another engineer in Parliament. And I want to welcome you, Simon. Tell us a little bit about what this three waters reform means, because you've been sitting on the select committee, so you're down to the detail. How would you sum up what the government is proposing here? What's the problem? What's the solution? And why does it go wrong?
Well, you've talked about the problem at Havelock North, where a local council water supply failed, and quite a few people lost their lives, and many people got very, very sick because contamination got into the water. So the first stage of the government's water reforms addresses that by setting up a water regulator that holds councils to account for delivering safe water. That's where ACT supports the government's current policy. But beyond that, we have major concerns about overreach. There's a prosecution and enforcement regime which has jail terms of 5 years and fines of $600,000, and it applies to small water suppliers, people who might have a bore on their property that supplies 3 or 4 houses nearby, or who have a dam or an irrigation scheme that supplies mostly farm water, but also supplies a few private dwellings. And what ACT believes is that those small suppliers should not be subject to the same enforcement regime, but they should continue to meet the current drinking water standards that apply to bores and anyone who supplies water to others.
Yeah, I find it astonishing you go to jail because of water on your farm. Look, I just want to quickly go to, before we go to Q&A, so we're launching policy today. This is ACT's response to what the government's doing. And we're not saying it's all rubbish and it's all a big conspiracy. What we are saying is that they're dealing with a real problem, but they're dealing with it in a way that, if anything, will make the situation worse, and is going to create a lot of division, particularly given the iwi governance provisions, which really got nothing to do with water quality and all about pursuing other political goals. People just want the water to work and be affordable. So can you run us through what would ACT propose as an alternative?
Well, we've come up with what we think are some really constructive ideas that address the concerns we're hearing about from people in communities around New Zealand, and also from those local government asset operators who actually know where all the pipes are and what needs to be fixed. We've come up with a concept of, rather than a compulsory government-forced amalgamation of assets, a shared services scheme where councils with smaller councils can gain the benefits of scale while retaining local ownership of their assets. We've also proposed a 30-year long-term partnership between regional and central government so that the assets that need fixing, the pipes that need fixing, the new subdivisions that need water in order to build houses can actually be supplied not just with the infrastructure, but with the money and the technical support to deliver it. It's a 30-year long-term regional partnership between central and local government. We're also advocating for more use of public-private partnerships. This doesn't involve selling anyone's assets, but what it does mean is that get money from the private sector, whether that's your KiwiSaver fund or your super fund or ACC, you've got a lot of money they want to invest in infrastructure, and partner up with central and local government to deliver these big projects that are beyond the size and scale of smaller councils to deliver. And again, we also believe that there should be an exemption for small water suppliers up to around 30 users to exempt them from the harsh penalty regime. And but they still have to deliver safe water, of course.
So altogether, I mean, what we're proposing is bottom up rather than top down. We're saying, look, councils may be facing challenges. It is pretty hard to run water infrastructure in the 21st century. But if they want help, rather than forcing a new system on them, they can talk to their neighbour about creating a shared services agreement, which is kind of how Watercare happened, right? Like there were a number of councils in Auckland before the super city that got together and created Watercare voluntarily. They set the governance on their terms, and then they can, if they still need help from central government, reach out from there rather than forcing everything on them if they want to get any central government money. Is that roughly what we're talking about?
Yeah, that's right. And there are small communities around Auckland and Rodney and Franklin which simply could never have afforded to upgrade their wastewater treatment systems or extend the pipe network to allow new subdivisions for housing to be built. They were projects that were costing tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. But by bringing together at scale a group of councils so they could go and seek the money that they needed and bring the expertise in, we've made huge leaps and bounds. Look, Wellington Water is another example of that shared services agreement. The difference is that Wellington Water doesn't have a way of raising any more money, and that's because the next part, where does the budget come from, and that long-term partnership with central government and seeking additional funds from the private sector, they haven't solved that part of the problem yet, but we believe our policy does.
See, what I like about this is that you can do this because you know how water works now, and it's evolutionary rather than revolutionary, building on what's been shown to work to solve problems that we acknowledge exist. And this is why it's great to have engineers in Parliament. It's great to be an ACT MP. Look, we want to turn to Q&A, so we might bring Mark back, see how his internet's going up in rural Northland. And g'day, Mark, you back? And then to go to questions. So Andre says, Simon, water infrastructure is ratepayer-owned assets and accounted for in municipal balance sheets. This move by central government appears to completely ignore rights of ownership, that is, willing seller and buyer. If the government is that interested in water quality, it can set and oversee delivery standards as any effective government should, without acquiring the assets by dictate. What am I missing here, or is it an asset grab for direct control? Says Andre. Simon, what's the answer to that?
Well, Andre's pretty much nailed it. There's no need to have a big asset acquisition process. If the government was to set the standards and then provide a mechanism like a shared services agreement and guaranteed funding over 30 years for their part of the major projects, then we could solve this problem without the revolution that the government's proposing and without having to sacrifice local decision making over what people really hold dear. It's their water, and it's their beaches and their harbours that they're concerned about pollution. And so that's why it's important that there is local control and elected members having decision making.
Yeah. This is probably another one for you, Simon. It's from Anthony. Given that some of those that Nanaia Mahuta identifies as having to pay annual rates of $10,000 in the future, if this asset confiscation does not go ahead, will no longer be paying that. Who will be paying the work to be done in those areas? Who will be the winners and losers? So I guess what he's saying is, look, Mahuta has identified, and that's the Minister of Local Government, Nanaia Mahuta. She has identified that the cost of maintaining water services is going to keep rising. I wonder if you have any insight into whether or not that's true. And I guess the question is, will it be cheaper or more expensive under our proposal or under what the what the government's currently proposing of the mega mergers?
Well, one of the problems with the current way these services are delivered and paid for is that it all has to be paid for up front, whereas a public-private partnership model allows private funding to pay for the infrastructure up front, but for local government and the users to pay for it over a much longer period of time, like 30 years, for example. We already have great public-private partnerships that are delivering services in this way, like the Northern Motorway, north of Auckland, and schools and hospitals have also been delivered under this model. And at the end of that 30-year period, the community gets an asset returned in good quality, good condition, and it hasn't cost them an arm and a leg up front. And so we actually think our policy will solve that particular issue.
So I guess really the problem that both the government solution and our solution are trying to get at, and tell me if I'm wrong here because you're the local government expert, is that the councils are up against their debt limits. You know, they're not allowed to borrow more, and we probably shouldn't want them to. The government's basically saying, well, give us the assets and we'll look after them through these 4 entities. What ACT's saying is you can keep the assets, but we'll free you up to take on public-private partnerships with, you know, an ACC or a KiwiSaver or an institutional investor, so you can get your working capital that way. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the government's proposal basically takes all the risk of funding this and all of the future debt requirements onto the government's books and has the taxpayer on the hook for it. Now, the government has huge pressures to spend money on schools and hospitals and giving nurses a pay rise and actually finding the money to pay a bit more for vaccinations. It makes more sense that the private sector takes on the debt because they're going to be, whether most of these contractors operating your local water services are private sector contractors anyway. So it makes more sense that they're taking on the debt, taking on the financial risk, and we hold them to account in terms of delivering that water quality to our taps and keeping our beaches clean.
It's a really good insight. You know, people always say, oh, the government should fund everything because it can borrow cheap. I just want to say the reason the government can borrow cheap is it's basically got 5 million workers that it can tax as much as it can get away with. And I would loan money to the New Zealand government too, because I know that they're going to run out. And if they do run out of money to tax, they just print more, as we're currently seeing. So yes, the government can borrow cheaply, but it goes down to the taxpayer either getting taxed or having their savings inflated away. Anyway, I just had to get that
That's
in there.
Right.
It's David, not me, says it's the hidden agenda at the front of this. Will privatization follow? Transfer of ownership to a few individuals. Who's going to own the water that falls out of the sky? I think that's called rain. Who's going to charge me for that water out of the sky, and how much? Where is the money going? Who is going to own the water tank that I put in my property that I've paid for? So this is a really interesting question. I mean, you look at Mark, you know, he's got his own water facilities because he's got quite a big farm, and as the gentleman says, a lot of water falls on it out of the sky. So is there anything in this current proposal that means that he would somehow no longer own that and would need almost permission to use it? That's a Simon question.
Oh, cheers, David. Look, the risk is that for small water suppliers, that they'll be brought under a regulation, but which penalises them, treats them as if they're a big corporate.
I think Mark's having a bit of internet trouble there.
Yeah, but the real risk is with this new water entity that if it includes stormwater and they're thinking about water flowing from the sky from the top of the catchment down the river to wherever it's needed, if these organisations that are unelected and include not just iwi organisations, representatives, but also unelected appointments from council, they will have the role of actually allocating water. And no one's talked to us about that yet. No one's made that clear to New Zealanders that that's one of the implications of these reforms, that somebody else will be in charge of allocating water. And New Zealand is fast losing trust with this government's reform process, and that's one of the main reasons.
So hang on, I mean, this is quite substantial because it started off, this is really just about the assets. It's about the pipes, it's about the tanks, it's about the dams. It's about the sewers. It's basically about a lot of concrete. But you're saying that it's also about that age-old question of who owns water.
That's right. We've heard submitters asking government to tell the councils and tell communities how they're going to resolve this issue, because it's not possible for councils to transfer assets to a corporate without answering that question and without government answering that question to its treaty partner. And yet there's nothing in this reform proposal that addresses that. So people are rightly suspicious. They feel the government is showing them one card at a time with these 3 water reforms, and then hiding that card, and then showing them another card with local government reform and hiding that card, and then the same again with resource management reforms. So New Zealanders are rightly concerned that this is a transfer of ownership to unelected people and unelected decision makers.
Yeah, it's a real back step for democracy by the looks of it, and that's before you bring in the concerns around the co-governance. I just want to finish by just going to Mark. We've only got a minute or two left, but Mark, what's the feeling in Northland? I think there'll probably be similar feelings in the South Island right now, where people are saying, look, we don't like Auckland at the best of times, and yet we've sort of been caught up in this. Warkworth is not actually in Northland. I just want to tell the Prime Minister. What's the mood in Northland this afternoon, knowing that you've effectively been lumped in with Jeffers?
Look, there's 2 veins of thinking, David. One is that we've celebrated the fact that not embroiled in the controversy, but equal difficulty in logistics. So we're all concerned that this COVID reality is going to spread and economic activity is going to be affected by it. The dear old farming community just gets on with getting on, but yeah, we're some island in an island up here.
Yeah, well, look, I hope that everyone stays safe and we can get out of it as soon as possible. I just want to finish by thanking both Mark and Simon, both of whom, like all ACT MPs, have been working really hard through the lockdown, taking people's emails and calls and trying to help people deal with the great hydra that is government. So thank you for all your work, guys, and we hope to see you back in Parliament soon. We just got to see a little bit more testing and tracing from this government so we can contain the outbreak. Well, that was our discussion of the Three Waters policy. It's going to be a major issue. It's going to be all about water rights. It's going to be about governance. It's going to be about who owns infrastructure, whether people can get responsive service that actually understands their ability to pay. And ACT has taken an approach to this of listening for a while. We've been hearing people from a long time all over the country on our Honest Conversations tour. We've had lots of emails, and we've landed at a position. We're not saying it's all a terrible conspiracy and there's nothing wrong and it's just an asset grab. What we are saying is that the government has a real problem that it wants to solve, and we support them in that. There's been issues with water quality, quite high-profile ones. There's been some real issues around sewage on the streets in Wellington, on the beach in Auckland. There's been issues for developers trying to build homes for the next generation. There are real problems with the way things are managed right now. That doesn't mean that any solution the government puts forward is an improvement. That seems to be their logic, and it's faulty logic. Add into that the centralisation of governance and the pursuit of a co-governance agenda that's actually nothing to do with water. It's all about treaty politics, and you're set up for a real political and policy disaster when it comes to Three Waters reforms. ACT's solution is different. We start by respecting communities and councils and the assets that they've built up, but we acknowledge that they may have challenges around how they actually maintain the assets in the 21st century. It's not easy to do. We say that there is a place for shared services agreements. Some of the Auckland councils before the Super City created water care. Wellington councils have created their own shared services agreement for their local water corporation. Other councils may wish to do this in the future. We should provide a framework for them to do that is voluntary and democratic. And then when it comes to issues with maintaining water quality, we should actually make sure that there are long-term 30-year partnerships between each region and central government for infrastructure, which is actually ACT's policy for all infrastructure, not just Three Waters, because we have a problem with infrastructure in New Zealand, and it relates to the lack of coordination between central and local government. Finally, as Mark explained, a lot of New Zealand is not on a town water supply. Most New Zealanders are not actually under water care, thankfully. A lot of New Zealanders actually have their own water scheme, and the overreach involved, where you can go to jail for 6 years for something that happens with water on your farm, on your property, is completely unacceptable. So ACT would exempt any water scheme that has fewer than 30 households on it from those provisions. Now, they're still going to have to meet water standards, as they do now. We're just not so keen on putting people in jail. Our policy will be up on our website. Please have a look at it. Tell us what you think. We're always open to listening further, of course. And if you like it, make sure that you share it with other people who are concerned, because there's a lot of people thinking about this issue right now. I think together we can put up a positive and more practical proposal that sooner or later will become law. The campaign starts now. That's the end of ACT TV for this week. We hope everyone keeps safe, follow the rules. We've all got to do it to get out of this thing as soon as possible. Then we got to get a better response out of government. We hope that you have the best weekend that you can. For people whose businesses are struggling, we feel for you. We know how tough it is. We understand many of ACT's MPs have been or still are business owners, that uncertainty is a killer in business. We feel for you, and we're determined to win the next election and improve the conditions so that business is seen as a positive thing rather than a dirty word. For all those kids who are looking at their exams, we hope that you are managing to adapt to the situation, the change of routine, reset your goals, and use the ultimate resource that's your mind. Make sure you support your parents. They might be under a bit of pressure too. To everybody who's been watching ACT TV, thank you so much for your time. We hope you have a great weekend. And ACT TV will be back at 7 p.m. this Monday. Ka kite anō.